Everybody, those who are staying for the unapologetic class, stay in here. We're going to be going over the historical testimony of the New Testament to help verify that if you have any doubts or questions. Otherwise, the lobby is out there for all your fellowshipping needs. I know, I'm kicking y'all out. It's not nice. Bye, Anthony. He's like, I'm out of here. Alrighty, we're going to get rolling here in a minute. We got to learn to tell Pastor John to stop talking so much, and I can actually get started on time. All right. And if I could get a volunteer to hit the doors, that way they don't have to be bothered by me, and I don't have to be bothered by them. Thanks, Callan. See? What? I am in a big hurry. I'm going to do what? Wait, seriously? Wow, I get to usher in the season. All right, thanks, Troyce. All righty, so, yeah, move. Wait, what are you doing? All right, we are going to be jumping into more historical proofs of Jesus Christ. So today's lesson is going to be the historical proofs of Jesus Christ. Do we have early testimony? As I said, we're going through the criteria that historians use to verify whether or not an event actually took place. The last 2 weeks before I went to Chicago last week to celebrate my anniversary, and for those of you guys who are wondering, it was wonderful. Lots of food, lots of drinks, and that's all I need. I'm a very simple man. But other than that, then let's see. Yeah, what we did before was, do we have eyewitness testimony? And we were able to go through some various things, proving the fact that we have reasonable evidence to assume so. Now, I wanted to touch on something before I got rolling here, because Pastor John, it was really funny. A lot of times during the message, do I have other fidgeters, like service fidget people? I fidget. I have to do something in a service or I lose my mind. And it's not because Pastor John's not interesting. It's not because any speaker's not interesting. It's because I have a problem, and I recognize that. So a lot of times what I'll do is while I'm listening to something, I will be doing something more mundane on the side, and it just kind of helps me listen and focus that way. It's really weird. But it was funny because I had my Bible open to Genesis 38, which is Judah with Tamar. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with that story, but essentially Judah has sons, and one son, he is found wicked in the sight of the Lord kills him, and then his brother takes his wife and was found wicked, and God kills him, and then this whole situation with her continues. But did you catch at the very beginning when he mentioned when the Pharisees were trying to trap Jesus and like, all right, well, she has this many brothers, they all die, who is she going to be with in heaven? And did you guys find that very weird that the brothers would marry his brother's wife? Tell me that's not a little weird, right? Now, have you guys wondered as to why that happened in the Torah? I'm sure all of us have. It's so foreign to us because we're so far removed from it, and it seems so strange. So I wanted to quickly touch on that, just as I do eventually want to do a Torah deep dive in this class, so we can go over all the weird customs and why they exist. So one of the things with that is people don't realize how far removed we were in the hostile land that they lived in. So women were the most vulnerable among them. When someone went to pillage a place, what would they do? Kill the men, keep the women for sexual pleasure, and then kidnap kids and maybe raise them also for the same reasons. It's perhaps even slave labor. And it's horrifying when you think about that. You're like, oh, that is horrible. But what would happen with a woman who didn't have a husband was that she'd oftentimes become disenfranchised and cast to the side. Also with women, nowadays, I'm not trying to be gross in here, I'm just being honest. Nowadays, because of things like, period pads and tampons, women can actually function more regularly on a daily basis. They didn't have those things back then. So what would happen is that a woman who loses her husband would suddenly be disenfranchised. She has usually moved far away from her family, and they're not like us, which is a phone call away and a car ride, right? So what would happen? Well, the brother would, on behalf of his dead brother, take his wife in under his protection and his providership, and then he would provide her children on his brother's behalf. And now you go, what? That's messed up. That's so weird. And it is weird, okay? But he'd provide her children. Why? Because women, nowadays, we had this great feminist movement that's all like, oh, put women in the workforce, do this, do that. They didn't have that. A woman's sole existence was being the household provider in the sense of children and nurture. And they weren't like, oh, this is sexist. She wanted that. And so she didn't have children. She was looking at as God doesn't honor her, or God doesn't love her, God's upset with her even. So in order to act in a way that was in accordance, she wanted to be blessed with children. That was a big thing for a woman, which is also weird because women at 14, 15 years old were usually marrying guys in their 30s because that was what she was wanting. That was what she was designed for. So, and I know for us, we still look at that as weird, but you have to understand again, does that make sense though as to why? Otherwise, she'd be cast aside, possibly taken advantage of, even in that story with Tamar, she was traveling and she was alone, and Judah went to her and was like, hey, how much would it cost for me to sleep with you? And that's what would happen oftentimes with single women who were widowed, is that they'd just be taken advantage of by men. So that is why that system was put in place, so that way she'd stay in the family. Does that make sense? Stay in the family, protect her, provide her children. It's weird, but it's a different society, and they had different solutions because they were also surrounded by hostile people groups. So anyway, that's free of charge. There's, like I said, a Torah deep dive would be useful because a lot of people look at that as horribly sexist toward women and demeaning toward them. I was like, well, actually, it was a system that was implemented to protect women, especially for Judah and Israel. So now I'm talking about Judah, not the person, but the country. Anyway, so let's move forward. Do we have historical proof of Jesus Christ? Well, we're going to look at early testimony. This is actually my favorite thing to bring up because I hear skeptics regularly ask or state that the reason why this all happened is that it's a big legend, right? This is all a big legend and none of it actually really happened. But the problem is that in order for urban legends to be built up, there has to be a certain amount of time in between the testimonies, right? Otherwise, it's easily corrected and dealt with. So if we have early testimony, I want us to just take a moment to quote Craig Bloomberg here. He says, historical evidence moves us a long way toward demonstrating our belief. As a result, the faith that is necessary to fill in the remaining gap is reasonable. So in other words, as long as we have decent reasons for our beliefs, so we can put certain pieces together, any of the gaps in between, we can fill in with faith within reason, right? Because no matter what, we do that. We get as much evidence as possible and say the evidence points to this, and then we believe that on faith, right? Does that make sense? Are we tracking? Okay, all right. I'm saw eyes glaze over for a minute. I'm like, uh-oh, that's not good. I lost him. All right, so let's do a review of belief. Since we know the universe had a beginning, something cannot come from nothing, and the universe is finely tuned, right? That's the telos, and that organisms cannot turn into other organisms, then it is reasonable to consider a theistic worldview. If history could validate these claims, it would reasonably destroy any remaining doubt. And I think that's a fair assumption. Now, I know I haven't gone into a class on evolution yet specifically. I only mostly dealt with design and whatnot, but that's mainly because I still think evolution helps my case to make a case for God. And that's mainly because something has to hold all that together with how complicated mutations are. Most of the time, mutations are bad and kill things. So if you're talking about mutations that kept mutating and creating lively beings, I'm like, well, who guided that process? Well, it's a good way to argue for God, too. So no matter which way, how the turntables, right? All right. So AD 66, the Jews in Palestine led a revolt against Rome. This is actually extremely important to understand the New Testament first century era worldview, is that this whole thing with Jews in Palestine and the Roman occupation. The emperor sent an army led by a man named General Vespasian to regain control of the rebel areas. In AD 67, so a year later, Vespasian led siege to the rebel town of Jotapata in Galilee. By day 47, a young Jewish revolutionary chose to surrender to the superior Roman army rather than to commit suicide. But he won favor with General Vespasian and was later taken to Rome by General Titus, Vespasian's son. Afterwards, Titus destroyed Jerusalem and the Jewish temple. That's in AD 70, so 4 years after all this began. And this man, though, that was taken, that I'm talking about, this Jewish man, is named Flavius Josephus. You'll hear people quote Josephus a lot. I'm not sure if you've heard that name sounds familiar. This is who we're talking about. So, I went the wrong direction. So Flavius Josephus, let's talk about him. He's from circa 37 to about circa 100-ish. So he became what is considered to be the greatest Jewish historian of all time. He served as a historian to the Roman Emperor Domitian, or Domitian, however you want to say that, depending if you're American or Greek. And at this time, he authored an autobiography and 2 major historical works. Of his works is now the famous Antiquities of the Jews in AD 93. I actually have a copy of the Antiquities of the Jews. It is only about that thick and this big. Very, very large volume. So he served as a historian to the Roman emperor. So now keep in mind that this is a Jewish man who ended up siding with Rome. And you can imagine in the Jewish culture, that is treason, okay? That is like during the Revolutionary War, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to be a redcoat. And y'all would probably lynch me, right? Like, well, it was nice knowing Will. But in his 18th book, chapter 3, in section 3, Josephus says these words. At this time, the time of Pilate, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets had recounted wonders. Pretty quick synopsis of what took place in the New Testament, right? This is by a Jewish historian who is under Rome. One would say not friendly to Christianity, okay? Because he's a Jew for one, and probably a devout Jew at the time, and on the Rome side. He's got 2 things going against him against the Christians, right? So he's even saying right here, he's at least telling them their claims, right? Which means that these claims, if this is this early, these claims are not urban legend that just cropped up, right? This is something that people are claiming right here, right now. Enough to make Josephus actually write about it. Jesus was mentioned in other works of his. Josephus reveals how the new high priest of the Jews, Ananias, took advantage of a gap in Roman rule to kill James, which is the brother of Jesus. So Ananias, I said Ananias, but Ananias, he actually, so there's this whole thing where there's different governors at the time, and this new high priest actually went after James, the brother of Jesus, and actually killed him due to a gap in power. Because I don't know if you know this, but the Jews could not always act out on their laws under Roman rule. The Romans actually kind of regulated them, and it was one of the things that frustrated the Jews a lot. So in AD 62, Emperor Festus just died, and 3 months elapsed before the new ruler, Albinus, could get to Judea. This allowed Ananias to fulfill his plan to kill James. So Yeah, when there's a break in power, how does it go where when the boss is away, what is it? Yeah, whatever. Yeah, when the cat's away, the mouse come out and play. That's it. I was like, there's something about that. I know that's how I feel whenever my boss isn't at work, so I'm just kidding. Actually, my boss is way too cool. That's the problem. All right, so Flavius Josephus says this: Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he, which is Ananus the high priest, assembled the Sanhedrin of the judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. When he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So we have Josephus recording these events that take place, and which is one of those things where once in a while you'll hear people talk about, like, well, I don't think we have good reason to believe that the apostles died the way they did. Because sometimes you're like, well, then why would they die the way they did, you know? I think based on other historical records, we can say that at least most of them, we have good record of them dying horrible deaths and not recanting their beliefs. So, what's the big deal about all this? That's another fair question. Whoops, my thing doesn't want to load. There we go. We have a historian mentioning Jesus multiple times outside of the accounts of the New Testament. How many of you ever heard that you believe that Jesus even existed just because the Bible told you so? No? Okay, all right, Sarah, thank you. A few people. People are like, oh, well, just the Bible tells you. Yeah, of course it does. It's a biased book. We have historical record of other people saying Jesus existed. To believe that Jesus entirely, even his life, to exist at all as a myth is to jump into the realm of fantasy. And there are many atheists who to this day who will sit there and they go that direction because it's easier to deny he even existed than to try to deal with half the data. So, there's not a ton, it's not like popular in the atheist community, but it is a thing that it crops up, okay? So he mentions the crucifixion and resurrection claims. He also mentions James, the brother of Jesus. He mentions the contempt of the Jewish authorities, and he mentions the death of James as the New Testament implies. All of these validate the claims of the New Testament as historical facts, don't they? Do any of these contradict it? No. You're actually going, yeah, sounds about right. So then if we move forward to other historians, so let me ask you this. How many non-Christian sources do you think mention Jesus? Because now another thing that historians do is they don't just look for the people, the one side, right? We look for what we call enemy attestation. Are there people who are against this group who also attest similar things? And I think that's perfectly fair, because if you have the enemies that say it's true and the other people saying it's true, most likely it's true, right? So let's move forward a little bit here. So we have other sources, and I'm just going to kind of give cursory views here, because that's what the point of this series is, to give you guys a brief overview. If you want to dig in, you can. I can give you resources. So including Josephus, if we include Josephus, there are 10 known non-Christian writers who mention Jesus all within 150 years of his life, which is very early in this time frame. So many of you guys might not realize this, but the way history is recorded now is not normal in the ancient world, okay? So as people are recording things, if you're getting this much being recorded at the time, it means something caused quite the stir, right? Something caused quite the fuss. So in order for this many people to write about him, something took place. For comparison, over the same time frame, there are 9 non-Christian sources who mention Tiberius Caesar, the Roman emperor during the time of Christ, which means Jesus wins by 1. From the emperor, by the way. So, is this early testimony? Absolutely. Nowadays, I think we expect, if anything historical happens, we expect it to be recorded like that and then shot to all the journalist communities, right? But that's not how it worked back then. In fact, very few people even knew how to read or write. So You have very few people who know how to read or write. Then you have fewer people who are even historians. And then you have fewer people who are even going to write on those particular historical events. So to have this many sources that survived over 2,000 years is impressive. Does that make sense? So, moving forward. Oh yeah, actually no, I shouldn't have. By removing all Christian sources, I should say this, Jesus is actually mentioned by one more than the emperor himself, and if you include Christian authors, Jesus outnumbers Caesar from 43 to 10. And again, this is the emperor, and Jesus is mentioned by more sources than even him. So some of these sources include Celsus. Many of you guys may have heard the name Tacitus. Does that ring a bell? Okay. Greek names are fun. The Jewish Talmud, which would be mostly considered anti-Christian. I do want to clarify some things on the Talmud. How many of you guys have ever heard of the Talmud? All right, good. All right. One of the problems is with Christians is that we try to talk about Judaism while knowing nothing about Judaism. So what you'll hear is that the Talmud, and tell me if this sounds familiar, the Talmud is a bunch of writings of a bunch of Jews who have argued about the most mundane things and they hated Jesus. Does that sound about right? Sound like a synopsis you may have heard at church sometime? Okay, so here's some of the descriptions about Jesus. It says that he is, in the Talmud, it says he is burning in hell in hot semen. That's one of the descriptions. Messed up, right? The issue is that that's one rabbi. The Talmud is a library. It is a whole library of Jewish writings of different rabbis throughout the ages. So you have dozens upon dozens of rabbis sharing their thoughts in the Talmud library. Because also in the Talmudic library, it talks about how moral and good Jesus was, how righteous he was in the face of the law. There's different rabbis giving their own opinions of Jesus. And you guys might know this, that Jesus had a large Jewish following. Why? Because you guys, if you guys read Paul, he came to the Jew first and then to the Greek. All his followers were Jewish except like Luke and a few others. So before we just broad brush it goes, Jews don't know anything about Jesus, time out, hold up. When I'm talking about the Talmud, it can be considered anti-Christian depending on which person you read, okay? So I just want to make that clear. It's like if we got all the sorts of pastors since the founding of the church and put them in one giant library. And then could you imagine if somebody was like, well, that library is anti-Semitic. Because there's a few people in there who were. But don't you think that would be unfair to the rest of the Christian authors in there? Absolutely. So my thing is a couple hundred years after the resurrection of Christ, there was this little movement that became very anti-Jew in the church. And then we see that hardcore in the Reformation with someone like Martin Luther, who says some very intense things about the Jews. So I want us to make sure we're not looking at this with the wrong lenses. Is that okay? So, all right. So these works do not have any eyewitness testimony that contradicts the events described in the New Testament. That's important. So none of them contradict it. The writings are emphatically, though, anti-Christian for the most part, but the most neutral ones admit or at least confirm many historical facts of the New Testament. So the anti-Christian ones would try to say what they claim and then paint them as religious zealots. That's usually what you'll run into, okay? So now let's talk about the congruent timeline a little bit, because they all kind of have this idea. So through these non-Christian sources, again, non-Christian sources, we can put together a congruent timeline that Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. We can confirm that he lived a virtuous life, that he was considered a wonder worker, that he had a brother named James, and he was acclaimed to be the Messiah, and that Christ was likely crucified April 3rd, AD 33. All these pretty close, right? So, all right, congruent timeline continued. Let's move forward. All right, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was crucified on the eve of the Jewish Passover, Super significant, by the way. We might get into that a little bit when we talk about prophecy. But darkness and an earthquake occurred when he died. That's actually recorded by other people, by the way. You know that whole thing in the New Testament where you're like, what? That actually happened. It's recorded by others. It's crazy. Phlegon, Africanus, Attalus, and Tertullian all mention this. Pretty sweet. His disciples were willing to die for their beliefs. Christianity spread rapidly across the known world as far as Rome, and his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. All these things we can confirm through the congruent timeline. All this sound pretty familiar? Maybe like you read it somewhere before? So, what does it say about the New Testament? Well, in light of non-Christian references, the theory of Jesus never existed is simply unreasonable, right? If you're trying to go, oh, Jesus never existed, Christians follow it, it's unreasonable, you're in fantasy. If you encounter somebody like that, they either are ignorant and haven't done the research, or they're obtuse and disingenuous and just trying to avoid evidence, okay? And it's best to pull that rug out from underneath them and be like, all right, have you ever studied this? No? Okay, well, here's some sources, help yourself out, or just call them out and be like, I think you're just being obtuse and just trying to avoid reasonable argumentation. So what does it say about the New Testament? That non-Christian sources affirm the New Testament, or at least they don't contradict it. While non-Christian authors do not say that they believe the resurrection, they do report that the disciples certainly believed it, okay? And the disciples are the ones who are closest to Jesus, so I think they're the ones who probably are the ones that matter the most what they believed. Could it be that the New Testament is not biased religious writings, but instead describes events that actually occurred in history? Why not, right? We have plenty of evidence that God is real, by the way. We've already done some of the most basic arguments in here, and I think those alone are reasonable reasons to believe in God. So if this is true, then this would confirm Christianity without a doubt. Because, guys, we're doing this whole, the last week series here at church, and I'm actually really excited that this just happened to coincide with that series, because what he's doing is he's walking you through the events, and I'm walking you through the historical data of that. And it's pretty cool because I did not plan that, but providence is a neat thing. But it's important because Christianity isn't like most religions. We claim historical, factual events. Right? Like, we claim that this actually happened. And this is why I say all the time, the singular truth of Christianity is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Everything else we can have fellowship with, but you must believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, right? That's the central event. That's the event that kicked off the rest of the New Testament. So, there are two questions that need to be answered. Man, we're moving. I'm liking it. In order to confirm the New Testament as fact, we have to answer two questions. Do we have accurate copies of the original documents that were written down in the first century, and do these documents speak the truth? How many of you guys, and I know I have an online audience and some of these people listening over here, for you all, I know there's some of you who believe this, so understand the fact I love you, but we're about to disagree. And I'm going to demonstrate as to why. I know it's weird, I'm talking to my phone. But all right, how many of you guys have ever heard of the King James only movement? People who believe that the King James Bible is the one singular word of God for English-speaking people, blah, 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 and we could go on. And, all the other ones remove the word of God and da-da-da-da-da. Problem is, it's a very, 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 what's the word without being antiquated argument. That's a better way to put it. Because it actually flies in the face, and this is why I say all the time, it hurts our ability to defend the New Testament, and here's why. I'm hoping to give you a bird's eye view of that. Do we have accurate copies of the manuscripts? If we don't, then we can't even confirm the King James Bible, for example, right? We can't confirm any of our Bibles. Our Bibles claim to be translations. So we can't confirm anything if we don't have accurate copies of the manuscripts. So, Numerous people independently witnessed New Testament events. Many committed it to memory, right? So 9 of those eyewitness contemporaries put their observations into writings, New Testament, each at a different time and location from the rest, preventing any collaboration. So this is what we call, like, you've heard the synoptic gospels, the gospels that reflect one another, but you have other events that take place throughout the New Testament, which means that all these people, different authors, at different times, at different geographical locations, all writing similar things. Okay? And they put it to memory. Why? Why would they put all these teachings to memory? Well, I'm not sure if you've ever noticed that Jesus' teachings have a way of, have you guys ever noticed the poeticness of them? That they're easy to put into memory? It's because he's Jewish. The Jews, that's how they taught. Because they were what we call an oral culture. You guys ever wonder why it was Moses that penned the Torah? It's like, well, the creation event took place way before Moses. It's because these were oral traditions or oral teachings that they memorized, they put to memory, and then they would teach. So you can imagine as Jewish men who went, wow, we need to record this, it's a little strange because normally they would just memorize and teach along, right? So for them to even pen it is pretty important. So do we have accurate copies? Well, if these things are true, then we should. So now let's do this. The New Testament is not one singular writing. I've mentioned that a lot in here, as is a misunderstanding by many unbelievers. But it's actually about 27 writings. 27 different scrolls by 9 different authors over 20 to 50 year period. Okay? That's a pretty big space of time. These books, among others, have been compiled into one book, which we call the Bible, which is from the Greek word biblia, which means just the books. Very creative. So the New Testament is not just one source, but a collection of sources. Does this make sense? Okay. So there's unity and diversity. So there's only one problem. None of the original documents have been discovered, but we only have copies of the original writings called manuscripts. And this is where, for me, the King James only argument and those things like that completely fall apart. Contrary to popular belief, this does not pose a problem, but it in fact poses a better proof. For example, we do not have this problem with Muslims because they have someone named Uthman, or Uthman, that took place. Now, I'll talk about him in a minute. But if we are dealing with a large collection of sources, okay, good, I have about 12 minutes. If we're dealing with this large collection of manuscripts and we don't have the originals. If you don't have the originals, how do you confirm the writing? It's tough, right? How do we know what was really written then? A lot of people, because of that, once they realize we don't have the originals, their faith just falls apart. Because like, oh, I can't confirm anything. But guys, we have so many manuscripts that we could compare to where it's like, wow, this has remained consistent through ages, geographically, in times of age, all of it. So it's easily confirmable. But then there's this guy in Islam named Uthman. I'm going to see, do I talk about? Yes. I will talk about Uthman for a second then. So Uthman, so you know how we have all these different manuscripts, and sometimes they have differentiations. Maybe a sentence is left out, maybe a word is added because they're doing it by hand. I've used this example before, but if I pulled out Genesis 38 that I wrote today, and I gave you guys each the same version of the Bible and told you to copy it by hand, would we have differences in this room? Yes, you'd probably have somebody who missed an H in the word that, right? You just have weird things. You'd have mispunctuation amongst all of us. Why? Because we're people. We're humans. We're fallible. But at the same time, do you think I could then remove all the same Bible version from this room, grab all your guys' copies of Genesis 38, and though it has differences, be able to put together what it really said? Yes. And that's what we call textual criticism. People get behind textual criticism. They think we're criticizing the Bible. That's not what we're saying when we say criticism. We're saying we're looking at it and comparing it, okay? Now let's talk about Uthman. I know I've said that 3 times now. Uthman was a Muslim who realized that the Muslim world was breaking off into different sects. So we have, to avoid similarly what happened to Christianity, which, the Reformation and all these break-off denominations and groups, and Judaism before that, Uthman was alarmed by this, and what Uthman did is he was like, all right, hold up, time out. What we need to do is we need to establish a proper Quran. So what he did is he took all the Qurans from across the entire nations, had them all destroyed, and he created and wrote his own Quran, and he goes, this now is the Quran. All right? All the things before, we don't need them. Does this sound like similar to King James onlyism, by the way, a little bit? A little bit? Okay, because it should. And then he goes, this is the new standard. But what happens? Well, what happens with this is now the entire Muslim world has to hope and pray that Uthman got it right, that he didn't miss anything, that all the things are properly in there, because they don't have not just the original Quran, but they don't even have the copies of the copies of the copies before his. And now they have to take it on in faith. If that was what my faith was based on, I would be on very shaky ground, right? Because I would be like, I don't know, that guy may have had an agenda. How do I even... And it sounds like he did. So the point is here is that I'm glad that we have differentiations in manuscripts that go back so far, because it helps confirm the historical story, right? That these people, even farmers, fishermen who are illiterate, were just copying things down. They might not even be able to fully read what was going on, but they were just copying what was in front of them. Pretty cool, actually. So the only problem, so let's see, one problem, All right, so all significant literature from the ancient world is reconstructed from copies into its original form by comparing the manuscripts that survive. This is everything. This is from Homer's Odyssey to every other ancient thing, okay? So that's how it's rebuilt. This is how the Bible's rebuilt, okay? This is a great way to compare accuracy and being sure that it is not embezzled in any way, okay? Actually, the lack of embellishment helps confirm the Bible further. Like I said, I mentioned this before, if it just kind of says what took place, it's usually a good indication that that is what took place, right? You read Luke, and Luke's just like, yep, and he threw some mud on his eyes, and the blind man was healed. Moving on, then he went to Smyrna, and you're like, what? And again, because he's not embellishing, it's a good way to show the fact that this took place. Other historical manuscripts that are embellishing have that. I think I mentioned this before, but the Gospel of Peter was written later, and then also has literally the cross walking out of the tomb declaring the resurrection. Very strange. So, one of the biggest historical proofs of any document is how close to the original events it was written. This is what we call being early, like early testimony, early manuscripts. So in other words, the earlier the manuscripts, the more accurate the reconstruction. This is actually what makes Alexandrian texts and the Dead Sea Scrolls so vital to the discussion. Because for so long, we were like, do we have the right Mosaic text? Do we have the right Old Testament? And then we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were super ancient. And we're like, oh my word, this is like word for word. That's pretty cool. And then on top of that, Alexandrian text. Now, for those of you guys who are more familiar with King James onlyism, you might have heard about the Alexandrian text being the evil text, the corrupted text. Is this new to anybody in here? Okay. All right, so because it has less information, it has a few less sentences, it leaves out an entire the last chapter of Mark, things like that. And people are like, whoa, they're corrupt, it's missing stuff, but they're the oldest ones we have. So then we have to start asking ourselves, did that last chapter of Mark get there from tradition? Was it originally part of it? Was it added later as embellishment? Huh. And it depends which scholar you ask, but most scholars will say that the last chapter of Mark, like not the last chapter, the last chunk of the last chapter, doesn't actually belong because most of our ancient ones don't have that. That's the one that deals with like, hey, if a viper bites you, you're going to survive. That whole part. That might sound familiar to some of you. And it might be weird if you ever read it. You're like, yeah, but I'm not going to try it. It's probably why, because it might not have actually been in there originally. All right, moving forward. Oh, wait, maybe not. It doesn't want to move. What's going on? So, try it again. There we go. So, how does the New Testament fare in regards to the rest of early writings? And the answer is simple. Far better than everything else. But I am going to save that for next week, because I'm going to pull up a chart that really kind of exposes the whole thing. And it's going to be fun. But do we have any questions or comments? I'd like to try to end things at least with a little discussion. Wade.
The argument is that the monks put those texts away and did not use them because they knew they were bad, which is not very good logic.
Right, no, absolutely. Well, it's funny because they did say that. That's why the old ones survived for so long, because they weren't good, and so they weren't wore out. But the problem is it ignores geography, that Alexandria is in a drier environment, and therefore the types of manuscripts wouldn't rot away. They would just be drier and fragile. So yeah, that's a weird argument. There's other ones where it's like, oh yeah, well the monks, they found, Codex Sinaiticus, which is one of our other really ancient sources for the New Testament. Like Codex Sinaiticus was found in a trash can. You'll hear that propaganda a lot. Really what it was there's this little can when it was found. There was a bucket, and it was, some of it was in there, I should say some of it, and there's two conflicting accounts historically. One of them says it was a repair bin. What they're saying is that they put all these in here to be repaired and then restored into the original text, or it was the castaway bucket, and that's where they'll go, see, it's a trash can. It's like, so that ancient text, the Alexandrian text is garbage. Like, no. It's a discarding can because they already restored it and put the trash one in the trash that was wore out. So no matter which way you spin it, it's not true. So anyway, that's a short synopsis on that one. But yeah, any other comments so far? Is anyone surprised by how many people actually mention Jesus in the ancient world? It's kind of surprising. Nothing? Either I'm a super thorough teacher or y'all fell asleep. Okay. Well, with that being said, do we have it real quick, one more time? Any questions, comments, or insults? Yes, sir. Well, we covered that a little. Were you here for we did some, we did 2 classes, 2 weeks in a row of canonicity. And we talked about that a little bit. And we basically showed how there's, first off, the Torah has never been under question because those were always considered by the Jews to be the canon, right? The biggest question was the New Testament. So what we did is we went through and showed the earliest church father, what he said was canon, which left out some of the books we have, and then other ones, and throughout the different ages, what they chose. So the main argument I put forth is the fact that if many people are wondering if we're missing something, we're not. If anything, we'd have too many. But even though, and the biggest 2 that were ever under fire was Hebrews and Revelation. Those were the 2 that was mostly under fire. Hebrews because of the Jewish bent. So a lot of the people who wanted to separate from Judaism didn't like Hebrews, and a lot of Jewish people didn't like Hebrews for obvious reasons. And then Revelation because it is very strange and obscure, and it was a little too odd, and so someone wanted to cast it out. So we did get that into a little bit, but I would like to, in this class, eventually go through the different councils and what took place and why. That would be fun. Because then that's where you can start picking apart, like, hey guys, well, this is what this council said. What do you guys think about that? And you guys can start seeing where certain things became more more doctrine. like the Trinity. You can see where that took place. Because that was a big debate for a long time in Christianity, by the way. That was not an established, like we take it for granted, right? Like we're Trinitarians. That was not a thing in the earliest church. There was a big debate about it. Actually, Trinitarians for the longest time were a small group versus people who were not Trinitarian. And then over time, argumentation over argumentation, digging into the scripture, eventually people came out Trinitarian. So history is weird. But it does allow us to be able to like I said, we shouldn't shy away from it though, because that's our faith. We have a historical like heritage here, guys. Like it's cool. Also, it means that we probably shouldn't be super hostile to people who slightly disagree with us, because at some point in the church, if you go back, you'll find somebody who probably disagreed on that same point, but they were still believers. So, cool.